right, so I like the title of this, negotiation across cultures. But of course, negotiation is just another form of communication. So the real subject is communication. And I am a great believer in storytelling, as one probably knows. People like to tell stories. The issue for me is why. And what does that mean, and why do we need to know about it? Actually, I have made an assertion, and I wrote a book about this about 15 years ago, that stories are actually the only thing we know. We don't know anything else. And we communicate in stories because we have no choice. You feel yourself obligated. I have a story I want to tell you. It's like it wants to come out. You meet somebody at a cocktail party, whatever you say to them, you said it before. I mean, it's a rare moment when you say, and I had one the other day. Somebody asked me something, I said, wow, I don't even know what I think about that. Usually I know. I know what I'm thinking, and I've said it 1,000 times. So the question is, how do you find the stories to tell? That is the question. Okay, I was looking up reminding on Google Images, and I got the finger thing, and I thought that was cute, because it's really, you're just reminded of them. Libraries are useless, and we have a library metaphor. It's now called knowledge management. It doesn't make any difference, which is just wrong. It's based upon the idea that all knowledge is can be written down in a certain form of story, which is typically 300 pages long, and that idea can be indexed by some name, when there might be 1,000 ideas in that 300 pages, and where those aren't all indexed, and so you don't know what's in the book, and the library knows the book in a vague way. But that sense of metaphor of papers and documents as where our information is just not how human beings have ever functioned. It's just a kind of recent idea. So my issue is, how do we know what stories to tell, and how will we tell them? And it's very obvious that when you have a story, and I say you say the same story all the time, you don't say it in the same way to everybody. You talk differently to a 6-year-old. All right. I mean, I just came back from a weekend with my two oldest grandchildren, all of 2 and 4. And I have lots of things to tell them, but I don't talk to them the way I'm talking to you. And if I tell the story, I have to figure a way to translate it. And that's true in another culture, of course. Of course, let's get clear about culture. Culture doesn't necessarily mean, Afghanistan. It means lots of things. This is a culture of a sort. And you say things differently in this culture than you would do in other ones. The most important thing is, of course, how do you know if your story is going to be understood? And some of this is obvious, but the least obvious of the list I have here is it needs to be full of details but short. Why does it need to be full of details? Because what happens with stories is you want people to remember them. And the only way they're actually going to remember them is if you lay something fun about it, something emotional about it, something unusual about it. The sense that a story is just devoid of details, like as in a proverb, doesn't make it memorable. And if it's too long, it doesn't make it memorable because people don't pay attention for very long. And I should point out that I'm doing something right now that I completely disagree with and don't believe in. Okay, lectures are nonsense. No one should ever give them, but one gets called upon to do it. And you know that people can't hear you. And the reason they can't hear you is really very simple. You're telling stories, and if you're doing what I say you're doing, you're matching what I'm saying to things you already think. And this puts you in an awkward position as I talk of either thinking about what you think or listening to me, but you can't do both. And so as a result, that's why there are multiple choice tests, right? Because as a result, no one can hear the entire lecture unless they refuse to think about it, which is an odd combination. All right. So story retrieval and storytelling is a 4-part process, and that's what I want to talk about. None of those 4 parts are obvious. Situation assessment means I am unconsciously trying to figure out what's going on here. I am unconsciously constructing an index into my mind based upon that first assessment. You don't know that you're doing it. I am unconsciously searching for the stories that I have. You don't know that you're doing that. And the only part of this that's conscious is the reformulation part. I found something I want to say. How do I say it right to this guy? That's conscious. So step 1, because we're in DARPA, I use military pictures. Now, why did I use a military picture? Because this is the Battle of Princeton, I think, 1777. And if I was going to build a handheld device for the leader of the Battle of Princeton, who I think was George Washington, but I'm not sure, I would want to be able to know about him certain things that we do know in principle. What are his goals? We know. What are his plans? We know. What's stopping those plans? We know that. What are the goal conflicts? We know that. We don't mean not every detail. We know a lot of stuff. And all that stuff is how we're going to get to the story, because the answers to those questions turn out to be the stories. And this leads to index construction, and I'm going to tell you a story. That picture is of Bob Abelson, if those people don't know what he looked like, who was my colleague for many years at Yale. But this is my classic story. Many of you will have heard it. If you haven't, it bears repeating because it's my favorite story. So Bob and I are having lunch one day, and I am whining to him about the fact that my wife, who is no longer my wife, but not for this reason, but my wife cannot make steak as rare as I like it. And I said, how could this be hard? But she can't do it. And he said, you know what? 30 years ago, I couldn't get my hair cut as short as I wanted it in England. Okay. Bob Abelson was not brain damaged. Okay. He's a very smart man. So I'm assuming he wasn't crazy, because otherwise it's a completely crazy response. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how those things matched until it crossed my mind that they not only matched, they were identical at the right level of abstraction. And the level of abstraction is, I have asked somebody who can do a service for me, who is willing to do that service for me, to do it for me, and they're refusing to do it because they think my request is too extreme. Is exactly the characterization of both stories. What happens in the understanding process is we try to take things that come in and abstract them up to that level. We do not do this consciously. We don't know that we're doing it. And if you ask yourself what the language of that stuff is, it always turns out to be, I had a goal, I had a plan, somebody obstructed the plan because of these conditions. They always look like that. Another example I always use is if you happen to be watching the movie or play West Side Story, at some point you're reminded of Romeo and Juliet, because they're the same story. But superficially, they're not. And it's for the same reason. You understand the goals and the plans and the impotence. Okay. A good index aids creative thought, and I have a very good example of that. This is a chemist at Procter & Gamble. I'm not talking about his idea, but someone else's idea.
Generating a bleach which was both strong and gentle required recognizing that we had a collateral damage problem. By recognizing that we had a collateral damage problem, it allowed us to tap into expertise in other apparently unrelated domains who also face collateral damage. One of those domains is oncology. And in oncology, they constantly face the problem that they want to destroy a tumor, but they do not want to destroy the tissue that surrounds it. They want to kill the tumor. They don't want to kill the patient. Many of the strategies which are applied in oncology, like the usage of pulsed sublethal dosing, are directly applicable to the bleach area. And we took some of those strategies, adapted them for bleaching, and produced products which are both strong and gentle.
Okay. So this is a representative of the guy who was head of innovation for Procter & Gamble, who came to me one day and said, I had a really brilliant idea, and I realized that there was collateral damage, and I could use what they did in chemistry, in chemotherapy. He said, can you help me do this all the time? Which is a tricky problem. But the key thing to know there, before we push on, is the concept collateral damage. Because that's an indexing term. Now, it's in English. It doesn't sound right, but collateral damage, when thought about, is a goal-plan interaction that we know. And if you come to that conclusion, if you recognize it as a that, you'll find other examples of collateral damage, and then you can figure out whether or not they're helpful. The fact that it happened to be helpful in making the bleach is of no interest to me whatsoever, but that's not the point. Okay. Step 3, story-based search. Those few of you who were in the room that day, and others of you who are actually really in the Army, will recognize the picture of this guy who is named Trevor Dupuis, who was a U.S. military historian who I one day invited to Yale, and in front of the 20 or 30 people in my lab at that time, 1 or 2 of them must be in the room, I interviewed him. And why I have these little pictures is it turns out all those pictures are battles prior to 1777 in the Revolutionary War, Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Trenton, whatever. And one would hope that old George, while doing the Princeton battle, remembered those. But it's too much to ask, really. Because first off, he wasn't at all of them. And second off, they weren't quickly writing lessons learned from these things. So I'm arguing that that's what we want to build for the Army. Independent of the next point, or any organization. I'm just talking Army because we're here. But what you need is something that says, this is the situation. I've indexed it this certain way according to what's happening here, and that reminds me of information that's relevant to you that could possibly help, because we've done this before. That does not occur, and it should. And when I was interviewing Trevor Dupuis, what about was this very same issue, even though it was 20 years ago. And in doing so, I learned a trick about interviewing that was very important. Because I don't know anything about military history, so I didn't know what to ask him. So I was asking things like, well, so did Napoleon ever do anything interesting? I don't know what to ask. But at some point, the answer involved the term strategic envelopment, which meant nothing to me, but I figured out after a while what it was. And then every question I asked had the word strategic envelopment in it. Was there ever a strategic envelopment used by Napoleon? Oh, of course there was. All right, and then we started to get stories, good ones. And so the issue of having the right language and being able to get into the indexing pops the indexing, because you don't even know what stories you have and you don't know how to tell them unless you learn how to find them yourself. And typically we don't do that consciously. So the interviewer, if you want to collect stories, which is what I want to do, had better be smart enough to figure out how to ask the right questions. I happen to be on my mind because I'm building a project just like this in pharmaceuticals starting next week, and I don't know what questions to ask. So this is, these are the issues. Okay, and last is reformulation, which I said is a conscious process. Whatever story you want to tell, if you wanted to tell it to one of these guys, probably you can't say it the way you would say it to your friends. And the answer is, how would you say it to them? I don't know. But I think if we don't know how to do that, we're dumb. I mean, we're not going to communicate. It's as simple as that. Okay. Comprehension means mapping your stories onto my stories and vice versa. That's what it means. That's how it will be comprehended. There is no one of you hearing my talk the same way as the next person to your left, because you're comprehending, mapping onto your information, your stories, your beliefs, and you're hearing them in those terms. You can't really communicate very well with someone whose stories are very different. That's why a blind date goes well or goes badly, right? Well, you understand the same stories, or we resonate to the same issues. So that's what makes people feel like we clicked. That's what they're saying. All right? So we also need to know what stories a listener could absorb, and that's the hardest thing in a foreign culture. It's just really difficult to say, to know that they'll understand a certain story. I'm going to tell you one of my stories. I have one day, recently I collected all my stories, or not all, a lot, to see what it looked like to index stories, but even I knew what they were about. Well, here's one of them. The two girls are there just to remind me that there's a story about somebody who had the following problem. His problem was a student of mine who had a problem, and he said, I decided to get married. I'm going out with two different women at the same time. I need to decide which one. And as as a professor, you get asked questions like this. Okay, I did all the time anyway. So this was one of my PhD students. So I said, okay, I'm not that stupid to say, marry girl A. I mean, that's just dumb. All right. So I said, tell me. So he says, well, one of them is really smart, but she yells at me all the time. He says, the other one is a lot less interesting, but she sure looks a lot calmer and looks like she'd be a good mother. More or less, that's what he said. Now, I'm not going to say, pick that one. This is what I said. I said, at that time, I was at Yale. In those days, I was running a business at the same time, and Yale was kind of yelling at me. And I said, okay, I'll hire a president, so I'll go back to doing professoring all the time. And I interviewed a guy, and he said he had a very great resume. He hadn't done a thing in the last year, nothing. I said, you did nothing in the last year? What did you do? He said, I was getting divorced. I said, that took all of your time? He said, well, if you want to get all the money and all the children. Okay, so I didn't think about that. And then a year later, we had a fight. And how do you think he behaved towards me? And that was my story. I said, be careful what people tell you about themselves, because they mean it. Now, that made him make a choice, or helped him make a choice. He did, in fact, make a choice. And to my knowledge, his a 20-year-old story is still married to the woman he chose. Whether my story helped or not doesn't matter. It's not the point. The point is, we give advice through stories. If we're smart, we don't tell people the answer. There is no answer. We give ways to think about the world. So the real question is, how does thinking work? That's the issue. And I, in my major occupation in this world, am trying to overthrow the school system, which is not the subject of this talk. But when I do try to do that, I try to point out that there are at least 12, be 14 or 6, it doesn't matter, cognitive processes that just are the basis of thinking. And that, unfortunately, when the president of Harvard designed the current school system, the one in 1892, not now, designed the current school system, he was thinking about the academic subjects being taught and researched at Harvard, not about cognitive science, which isn't particularly shocking. And so the school system is designed around subjects instead of what it should be designed around, which is these 12 processes. It is very important to understand these 12 processes, because that's the story when you're talking about negotiation across cultures. You're talking about each of them, actually, and how to communicate about them. So I have, as you might imagine, stories associated with all of them. The first story is